March 6, 1944. 28,000 feet above Berlin, Hauptmann Walter Oesau banked his Fokker-Wulf 190 hard to port, the skeletal ruins of the Reichstag visible through broken clouds 6 miles below. For 3 years, he had defended German airspace with methodical precision, destroying 97 Allied aircraft and earning the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. But on this freezing morning over the Reich capital, Oesau witnessed something that shattered every tactical assumption the Luftwaffe had constructed about American bomber operations. American fighter aircraft circled the skies above Berlin at combat altitude, not the twin-tailed lightnings that occasionally penetrated this far with maximum fuel loads and prayer. These were different. Sleeker, faster, more numerous. Single-engine fighters with distinctive bubble canopies and laminar flow wings, escorting a formation of 75 B-17 flying fortresses directly over the heart of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. Impossible, Oesau muttered into his oxygen mask, condensation freezing immediately against the rubber. His ground controllers had briefed him that morning with absolute certainty. American single-engine fighters lacked the range to reach Berlin. The distances were mathematically insurmountable. 560 miles from England to the German capital, 1,120 miles round trip. 5 hours minimum flying time. Fuel consumption calculations proved conclusively that no American single-engine fighter possessed sufficient range for such missions. Yet there they were. 96 silver aircraft maintaining formation discipline at 25,000 feet, engines running smoothly after crossing the North Sea, traversing occupied Holland, penetrating 300 miles into German airspace, and still possessing sufficient fuel reserves for combat and the return journey home. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of what Oesau witnessed were rewriting the strategic calculus of the air war over Europe. The North American P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard Merlin V1657 engine producing 1,695 horsepower and equipped with revolutionary external drop tank technology, had just destroyed the Luftwaffe's most important defensive advantage. The psychological impact on German pilots would prove more devastating than any tactical defeat. Their sanctuary had been breached. The deepest targets in the Reich now lay vulnerable to American fighter Escort. The crisis had been building since August 17, 1943, when the 8th Air Force launched coordinated deep penetration raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The American bombers flew without escort beyond the limited range of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings. German fighters attacked with devastating effectiveness. 60 bombers failed to return from a force of 376. Nearly 600 American airmen died, were captured, or went missing in a single day. The disaster repeated itself on October 14, 1943, remembered by 8th Air Force crews as Black Thursday. Another attack on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, another massacre, 60 B-17s shot down, another 594 airmen lost. The casualty rate approached 20%. At such losses, no military force could sustain operations. American commanders suspended deep penetration bombing raids into Germany until a solution materialized. The Luftwaffe had won a decisive tactical victory that autumn. German fighter pilots had proven beyond question that unescorted daylight bombing deep into Reich territory was operationally impossible. The heavily armed flying fortresses, designed with overlapping defensive fields of fire and protected by armor plate, could not defend themselves against determined fighter attack. The entire strategic bombing doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces stood discredited by German bullets and cannon shells. But American industrial capacity was already producing the aircraft that would transform the air war completely. The solution emerged not from strategic planning committees or tactical doctrine schools, but from an unlikely marriage of British engine technology and American airframe design that had begun 3 years earlier in April 1940, when the Royal Air Force approached North American aviation with an urgent request. The British needed fighters. The Battle of Britain had demonstrated that Hurricane and Spitfire production could not meet operational requirements. The RAF sought to purchase Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, manufactured under license by North American Aviation. Dutch Kindelberger, North American's president, countered with an audacious proposal. His company would design and deliver a completely new fighter aircraft superior to the P-40 in every performance category within 120 days. The British accepted. North American engineers worked with unprecedented speed. On October 26, 1940, exactly 117 days after contract signing, the prototype NA-73 lifted off from Mines Field in Los Angeles for its maiden flight. The aircraft incorporated advanced aerodynamic features, including a laminar flow wing design that reduced drag substantially compared to conventional airfoils. Test pilots reported exceptional handling characteristics and impressive low-altitude performance. But the Allison V1710 engine that powered early Mustang variants suffered from inadequate high-altitude performance. The engine's single-stage supercharger could not maintain power output above 15,000 feet. As bomber operations shifted to higher altitudes where German fighters operated most effectively, the Allison-powered Mustang proved unsuitable for escort duties despite its impressive range and handling qualities. The breakthrough came from Ronald Harker, a Rolls-Royce test pilot who evaluated the Mustang at Royal Air Force Duxford in April 1942. Harker immediately recognized that the exceptional airframe was hobbled by an inadequate engine. He recommended fitting the aircraft with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine featuring a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power output to 30,000 feet and above. British engineers converted 5 Mustangs to Merlin power. Flight testing in October 1942 revealed astonishing results. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. Climb rate improved dramatically. Service ceiling increased to 41,900 feet. Most critically, the aircraft maintained excellent performance throughout the altitude range where bomber escort operations occurred. North American Aviation quickly adopted the Merlin engine for American production. Packard Motor Company manufactured the Rolls-Royce engine under license in the United States as the V1657. By summer 1943, P-51B models powered by Packard Merlins were rolling off North American assembly lines at plants in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas at increasing rates. The P-51B incorporated internal fuel capacity of 184 gallons in fuselage and wing tanks. An additional 85-gallon fuselage tank could be installed behind the pilot, though this created dangerous center of gravity issues when fully loaded. The real breakthrough came with external drop tanks mounted beneath the wings. 2 110-gallon pressed aluminum drop tanks extended the Mustang's combat radius to over 850 miles. Total range with careful fuel management approached 1,650 miles, just sufficient to escort bombers from England to Berlin and return with reserves for combat and emergency. The drop tanks could be jettisoned before engaging enemy fighters, eliminating their weight and drag penalties. American factories manufactured drop tanks with remarkable efficiency. Each expendable fuel container cost approximately $15 to produce. The same industrial capacity that mass-produced automobiles before the war now generated tens of thousands of drop tanks monthly. For the price of a single fighter aircraft, American industry could supply drop tanks for an entire squadron's operations for months. German industry possessed no equivalent capability. Luftwaffe fighters were designed for shorter-range interception missions defending Reich territory. German drop tanks remained scarce, poorly manufactured, and rarely used in operational service. Japanese fighters employed drop tanks extensively in the Pacific Theater, demonstrating the technology's effectiveness, but German tactical doctrine and industrial priorities had not emphasized long-range fighter operations. The first P-51 equipped fighter group to reach Europe was the 354th Fighter Group, receiving aircraft in November 1943. Although officially assigned to the 9th Air Force supporting tactical operations, the 8th Air Force immediately requisitioned the unit for strategic bomber escort duties. The need was desperate. The losses from unescorted deep penetration raids had created a strategic crisis that threatened the entire daylight bombing campaign. The 354th flew its first mission on December 1, 1943, a fighter sweep over France. Initial escort missions followed quickly. Amiens on December 5th, Emden on December 11th, then Kiel on December 13th, the most significant early operation. The formation penetrated 480 miles into German airspace, forcing the Luftwaffe to respond in strength. The Mustang's long range had begun to alter the tactical equation fundamentally, but the real shock came in late February and early March 1944. By then, additional P-51 groups had arrived in England and completed conversion training. The 4th Fighter Group, stationed at Debden, 40 miles north of London, received Mustangs on February 28, 1944. Some pilots took off with less than 1 hour checkout time in the new aircraft. The operational urgency was that severe. 4 days later, on March 4, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group escorted B-17s and B-24s to Berlin. The first time single-engine American fighters had made the 1,100-mile round trip. German ground controllers initially refused to believe the reports. The defending pilots insisted they had encountered single-engine American fighters over the Reich capital. Intelligence officers demanded verification. The presence of such aircraft at that distance from any Allied airfield violated all known technical specifications and operational assumptions. The following missions confirmed the impossible had become routine. March 6th, back to Berlin. 17 Luftwaffe fighters shot down. March 8th, Berlin again. The American bomber streams now penetrated German airspace with continuous fighter escort throughout their entire mission profile. The short-range P-47s and P-38s still provided initial escort during climb-out and assembly, but when those fighters reached their fuel limits and turned for home, the Mustangs seamlessly assumed protection, staying with the bombers all the way to target and back to the North Sea before handing off to the shorter-range fighters again. The layered escort system provided continuous coverage throughout the mission. German fighters could no longer simply wait for Allied escorts to reach their range limits before attacking bomber formations. The Mustangs possessed sufficient endurance to maintain station with the bombers throughout their entire mission profile, engaging any German fighters that attempted interception. Major General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, implemented tactical changes that magnified the Mustang's impact. Previously, fighter escorts remained in close formation with bomber streams, providing defensive coverage but limiting offensive opportunities. Doolittle authorized escort fighters to leave the bombers when tactically advantageous to pursue and destroy German fighters before they could organize effective attacks. The new doctrine transformed the air war fundamentally. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack bomber formations, American escorts aggressively hunted Luftwaffe aircraft throughout German airspace. The objective shifted from simply protecting bombers to achieving complete air superiority by destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force wherever it could be found, whether in the air or on the ground. The campaign to destroy the Luftwaffe intensified during Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944. Operation Argument, as the offensive was formally designated, targeted German aircraft production facilities, engine plants, and ball-bearing factories with overwhelming force. Over 3,000 bomber sorties supported by extensive fighter escort struck industrial targets throughout the Reich. The American forces lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters during Big Week operations. Significant casualties demonstrating that German defenses remained dangerous and effective. But the Luftwaffe lost 290 fighters destroyed and another 90 damaged. More critically, the German fighter force lost 17% of its experienced pilots. Nearly 100 irreplaceable combat veterans killed in a single week of intensive operations. The exchange rate demonstrated that wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side that can replace losses more effectively. American aircraft production substantially exceeded losses. Pilot training programs graduated sufficient replacement aviators to maintain squadron strength. The industrial and training infrastructure supporting American air operations proved adequate to sustain the bombing campaign indefinitely, despite continued casualties. German aircraft production actually increased during 1944, despite Allied bombing, but replacement pilots could not be trained quickly enough to compensate for combat losses. Training time was reduced drastically in desperate attempts to maintain squadron strength. New pilots arrived at operational units with minimal flying hours and inadequate combat preparation. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots transferred from the Eastern Front to reinforce homeland defense often survived only days against the combined weight of American fighter strength and tactical skill. The fuel situation compounded German difficulties severely. Allied bombing targeted petroleum production and distribution infrastructure with increasing effectiveness. Refined aviation gasoline became progressively scarcer. Training flights were curtailed to conserve fuel. Combat operations were restricted by fuel availability rather than aircraft or pilot availability. The Luftwaffe possessed fighters. It lacked the fuel to fly them and the trained pilots to operate them effectively. For Hauptmann Walter Oesau, circling above Berlin that March morning in 1944, the presence of American Mustangs over the Reich capital represented strategic defeat. The Luftwaffe could no longer effectively defend German airspace against American daylight bombing operations. The sanctuary of distance had been eliminated by American engineering and industrial capability. Oesau continued fighting with the professional competence that had earned him Knight's Cross recognition. But 3 months later, on May 11, 1944, his Focke-Wulf 190 was shot down during combat with American fighters near St. Vith, Belgium. Oesau was killed instantly. He had survived 3 years of intensive air combat, only to fall to the overwhelming numerical and technical superiority that the Mustang represented. The Mustang's impact extended well beyond its impressive technical specifications. The aircraft enabled a fundamental shift in Allied strategic bombing doctrine that ultimately proved decisive in achieving air supremacy over Europe. With reliable long-range escort available, American bomber formations could strike any target within Germany with acceptable loss rates. German industry could no longer operate safely beyond Allied fighter range. The entire industrial infrastructure supporting the German war effort became vulnerable to systematic destruction. The transformation in bomber loss rates told the strategic story with brutal clarity. In October 1943, before Mustang escorts became available in significant numbers, 9.1% of 8th Air Force bomber sorties credited with attacking their targets failed to return. An additional 45.6% sustained damage requiring repairs. At such attrition rates, bomber crews faced mathematical certainty of death or capture before completing their required tour of 25 missions. By February 1944, with P-51 escorts providing comprehensive coverage, the loss rate dropped to 3.5% with 29.9% damaged. Still dangerous. Still requiring immense courage from every crew member climbing into a B-17 for another mission over Germany. But operationally sustainable, the strategic bombing campaign could continue indefinitely at these casualty levels, while German fighter forces were systematically destroyed in their attempts to stop it. The tactical advantages the Mustang provided went beyond simple range calculations. The aircraft possessed exceptional performance characteristics throughout its operational envelope. Maximum speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet gave Mustang pilots the ability to engage or disengage from combat at will against most German fighter types. The Luftwaffe's premier fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, could match the Mustang's speed under certain conditions, but not consistently across all altitude ranges and tactical situations. The P-51's rate of climb was excellent. Maneuverability remained superb throughout the speed range. The aircraft could turn tightly at high speeds without excessive control forces. Pilots transitioning from other fighter types consistently praised the Mustang's harmonious handling characteristics that reduced workload and enabled effective combat maneuvering, even during extended missions when fatigue became a serious factor. 6. Browning 50 caliber machine guns provided overwhelming firepower. Each gun carried approximately 400 rounds, sufficient ammunition for sustained combat against multiple targets. The weapons were reliable, well positioned for convergence, and generated tremendous destructive power against both air and ground targets. Mustang pilots returning from escort missions frequently strafed German airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground and further depleting Luftwaffe strength. The ground attack capability proved particularly valuable during the intensive airfield strafing campaign that intensified throughout spring 1944. Mustang groups systematically attacked Luftwaffe bases across Germany and occupied territories. The attacks destroyed hundreds of German aircraft on the ground, killed experienced pilots during takeoff and landing, and forced the Luftwaffe to disperse operations to smaller, less efficient airfields, with inadequate maintenance facilities and supply infrastructure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German pilots who survived encounters with Mustang-equipped American fighter groups carried vivid memories of technological and tactical superiority that fundamentally altered their assessment of Germany's strategic position. Lieutenant Heinz Nock, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot with 33 confirmed victories, recorded his reaction to encountering Mustangs in his combat diary. The American fighters possessed speed advantages that enabled them to control engagement geometry completely. German fighters could not escape when outnumbered. They could not pursue damaged bombers without exposing themselves to devastating counterattack. The psychological impact of fighting an opponent with overwhelming advantages in numbers, performance, fuel supply, and pilot training created a cumulative demoralization that eroded German fighter effectiveness beyond simple casualty statistics. Young replacement pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal training and faced immediate combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. Survival rates for inexperienced Luftwaffe pilots decreased dramatically throughout 1944 as American fighter strength increased and tactical proficiency improved through continuous combat experience. The captured aircraft testing program that had evaluated Lieutenant Thomas Fraser's Mustang at Rechlin provided German intelligence with comprehensive technical data about P-51 capabilities. Engineers created detailed performance reports documenting speed, climb rate, range, handling characteristics, and systems reliability under controlled test conditions. The findings circulated among Luftwaffe leadership, aircraft designers, tactical planning staffs. The reports confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting from actual engagements. The Mustang possessed decisive performance advantages in the most critical categories for strategic bomber escort operations. The systematic analysis highlighted the aircraft's exceptional range that enabled deep penetration missions, superior high-altitude performance from the two-stage supercharged engine, high maximum speed throughout the altitude envelope, and excellent handling characteristics that reduced pilot fatigue during extended missions. German engineers documented specific design features that contributed to observed Mustang capabilities. The aerodynamically efficient laminar flow wing reduced drag substantially compared to conventional wing profiles. The powerful Packard Merlin engine with sophisticated two-stage supercharging maintained power output to very high altitudes. Large internal fuel capacity, supplemented by external drop tanks, provided unprecedented range for a single-engine fighter. Thoughtful systems integration throughout the aircraft enhanced reliability and maintainability under operational conditions. The technical intelligence gathered through captured aircraft testing supported conclusions that existing German fighter designs required substantial improvements to remain competitive with current Allied types. Several ambitious fighter development programs were initiated during 1944 specifically to counter Allied air superiority through advanced technology. The Focke-Wulf 190D model incorporated an inline Junkers Jumo 213 engine for improved high-altitude performance compared to the radial-engined 190A variants. The Focke-Wulf TAR-152 represented a specialized high-altitude fighter optimized for bomber interception at extreme altitudes. Various revolutionary jet and rocket-powered designs promised performance substantially exceeding any piston engine fighter in service or development. These programs reflected clear recognition among German designers and military leaders that existing Luftwaffe fighters could not effectively counter advanced Allied aircraft like the P-51 Mustang given the performance gaps in critical operational areas. However, severe material shortages, production delays caused by Allied bombing campaigns, and the rapidly deteriorating overall war situation prevented these advanced designs from entering operational service in numbers sufficient to influence strategic outcomes or reverse Allied air superiority. The jet-powered Messerschmitt Me 262 represented Germany's most successful attempt to leapfrog Allied piston-engine fighter performance through revolutionary turbojet technology. The Me 262 possessed substantial speed advantages that made it extremely deadly against Allied bombers when flown by skilled pilots who understood how to exploit its capabilities. Maximum speed approached 540 miles per hour, far faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter could achieve. However, the type suffered from chronic engine reliability problems that limited operational availability dramatically. The Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines required complete overhaul after approximately 10 hours of operation. Many engines failed well before reaching even that limited service life. The Me 262 required extensive concrete runways that were vulnerable to Allied attack and could not be easily concealed or dispersed. The aircraft consumed vast quantities of increasingly scarce aviation fuel, and it arrived too late and in far too small numbers to alter strategic outcomes or seriously threaten Allied air supremacy over Europe. Even the Me 262's impressive technological advantages proved strategically insufficient to overcome overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and the Luftwaffe's collapsing infrastructure, fuel supplies, and pilot training programs. Germany possessed innovative aircraft designs and brave pilots, but the nation lacked the industrial capacity, resource availability, and strategic depth necessary to compete effectively against the combined Allied war machine that included American industrial production, British technological innovation, and Soviet manpower reserves. The final year of World War II in Europe witnessed the Luftwaffe's systematic dissolution as an effective fighting force capable of meaningful resistance. Catastrophic pilot losses exceeded replacement capacity. Severe and worsening fuel shortages grounded aircraft regardless of availability. Production difficulties caused by Allied bombing disrupted manufacturing, even as output increased numerically. Overwhelming Allied numerical superiority rendered tactical skill and individual courage strategically irrelevant. The captured aircraft testing program continued operating as long as practically possible, attempting to provide tactical intelligence that might improve German pilot survivability, even as strategic outcomes became inevitable and final defeat approached. German test pilots who had flown captured Mustangs extensively and understood Allied aircraft capabilities, faced the war's end with complex and conflicted emotions. Professional aviators appreciated the engineering achievements represented by aircraft like the P-51. Even while regretting their service on the losing side of history's most destructive war, many harbored no illusions about Germany's defeat being anything other than total and unconditional. Having witnessed firsthand the overwhelming material advantages Allied forces possessed in every dimension of military power, these pilots recognized that courage and skill alone could not overcome fundamental imbalances in industrial capacity and resource availability. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, provided perhaps the most candid German assessment of the Mustang's strategic impact during the post-war interrogation by Allied intelligence officers. Göring admitted that he was stunned by the first evidence that British and American fighters were flying over German soil for hours at a time. He stated that he was convinced deep bomber penetrations were possible only with long-range Escort, and that the Escort fighter capability came as a complete surprise to German strategic planning. Göring went further in his admission. He stated that when fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time in March 1944, he knew that the eventual results would be tragic. The man who had once boasted that no enemy bomber would ever attack Berlin, or his name was Meyer, a common German surname implying such an event would never occur, was forced to confront the material reality of American engineering achievement and industrial capacity. The Reichsmarschall's statement about long-range fighters delivering a major strategic blow to German planning was remarkable for its candor. Goering credited the Escort fighter, and particularly the P-51 Mustang, as one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. This professional acknowledgement from Germany's highest-ranking Air Force officer validated the strategic importance of the Mustang's appearance over Germany in late 1943 and early 1944. The admission illustrated how confronting uncomfortable realities sometimes requires direct personal experience that cannot be dismissed or explained away through propaganda or ideological assumptions. German intelligence officers had access to substantial information about Allied aircraft capabilities through various sources, but the psychological impact of seeing American fighters circling overhead deep in Reich territory, where they should not have been able to reach, according to all previous assumptions, forced a fundamental reassessment of Germany's strategic position. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe had been effectively defeated as a strategic force capable of meaningful interference with Allied operations. German fighters made minimal appearance over Normandy beaches, despite the massive concentration of Allied shipping and ground forces vulnerable to air attack. The Luftwaffe lacked sufficient operational aircraft, trained pilots, and aviation fuel to mount effective resistance against the invasion forces. The transformation in the air war from October 1943 to June 1944 was staggering in its completeness. 8 months separated the Black Thursday disaster at Schweinfurt from the virtually unopposed Allied landings in France. The primary factor enabling that transformation was the P-51 Mustang's arrival in sufficient numbers with adequate range to escort bombers throughout their entire mission profile while engaging and destroying German fighters wherever they could be found. Mustang-equipped fighter groups achieved extraordinary combat records during 1944 and 1945. The 4th Fighter Group, first to receive P-51s in the 8th Air Force, destroyed over 1,000 German aircraft both in the air and on the ground by war's end. The 357th Fighter Group, which included ace pilot Bud Anderson, became legendary for its combat effectiveness and aggressive tactics. The 352nd Fighter Group produced numerous aces and consistently achieved high victory-to-loss ratios. The African-American pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails for their distinctive aircraft markings, flew Mustangs on bomber escort missions from Italian bases beginning in summer 1944. Despite facing racial discrimination and limited opportunities for command positions, these pilots distinguished themselves in combat, shooting down 111 enemy aircraft and earning numerous decorations for valor and professional competence. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th Air Force's 15 fighter groups flew Mustangs. Only the 56th Fighter Group retained P-47 Thunderbolts, likely from unit pride given their excellent combat record with that aircraft type. The systematic conversion to Mustangs reflected clear recognition that the P-51 represented the most effective fighter available for strategic bomber escort operations. The Mustang's combat record speaks to its effectiveness with cold statistical precision. American P-51 pilots destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft during World War II, the highest total for any American fighter type in the European theater of operations. This achievement was particularly remarkable given that the P-51B and D models did not enter combat until late 1943, missing the first 18 months of American air operations over Europe. The aircraft served in every theater where American forces operated. While most famous for its bomber escort role over Europe, Mustangs also flew long-range missions in the Pacific, escorted B-29s to Japan from Iwo Jima, conducted ground attack operations in support of advancing Allied armies, and performed photographic reconnaissance gathering intelligence for tactical and strategic planning. Part 3. Final. The legacy of the Mustang's impact on World War II extends well beyond its impressive combat statistics and technical specifications. The aircraft fundamentally altered strategic bombing doctrine by proving that long-range fighter escort was not only possible, but operationally decisive. The principle that bombers require fighter escort for deep penetration missions became established doctrine that shaped post-war air power development and remains relevant in contemporary military aviation. The importance of aircraft performance, particularly speed and range, was demonstrated repeatedly during Mustang operations over Europe. Technical superiority in key performance parameters provided tactical advantages that skilled pilots could exploit for decisive effect. The value of quality training became evident through combat exchange ratios that consistently favored American pilots flying Mustangs against German opponents in inferior aircraft or with inadequate training. The necessity of industrial capacity to sustain prolonged operations was confirmed beyond question. American factories produced over 15,000 Mustangs between 1940 and 1946. This industrial output enabled the 8th Air Force to equip entire fighter groups with P-51s despite continued combat losses. Germany could not match this production capacity while simultaneously maintaining tank, submarine, and artillery output required for ground and naval operations. The engineering excellence that created the Mustang reflected collaboration between British and American expertise. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, refined through years of development for Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, provided the power plant that transformed a good low-altitude fighter into an exceptional high-altitude escort. North American Aviation's advanced airframe design maximized the engine's potential through aerodynamic efficiency and intelligent systems integration. The marriage of British engine technology and American airframe design represented the type of Allied cooperation that characterized the broader war effort. Neither nation alone possessed all the capabilities necessary to defeat Nazi Germany. Combined, their complementary strengths proved overwhelming. The Mustang embodied this principle in aluminum, steel, and high-octane aviation gasoline. For the bomber crews who flew deep into Germany day after day, the Mustang represented hope and survival. B-17 and B-24 aircrews nicknamed the P-51 pilots their little friends. The affectionate term reflected genuine gratitude for the fighter pilots who escorted them through flak-filled skies and intercepted German fighters attempting to shoot them down. Many bomber crewmen survived the war specifically because Mustang pilots engaged German fighters before they could press home attacks on bomber formations. The relationship between bomber crews and escort pilots developed into mutual professional respect, built on shared danger and common purpose. Fighter pilots understood that their primary mission was enabling bombers to reach and destroy strategic targets. Bomber crews recognized that fighter pilots risked their lives daily to provide protection against overwhelming German fighter strength. This mutual dependence created bonds that lasted decades after the war ended. The human cost of the air war over Europe was staggering regardless of aircraft type or national affiliation. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 dead during World War II, more fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps sustained in all theaters combined. The RAF Bomber Command lost 55,000 aircrew during the strategic bombing campaign. The Luftwaffe lost tens of thousands of pilots and aircrew defending German airspace against Allied bombing operations. These casualties represented young men with families, dreams, and potential contributions to society that were never realized. The waste and tragedy of war affected all nations, regardless of which side ultimately prevailed. The Mustang's effectiveness in destroying German fighters meant German pilots died in cockpits over their own homeland, while American pilots survived to return home. But survival came at psychological costs that many veterans carried throughout their lives. The bomber crews experienced particularly intense trauma, flying 30 or 35 missions in crowded, freezing, unpressurized aircraft, while German fighters attacked and flak exploded around them, created lasting psychological damage. Many crew members suffered from what was then called battle fatigue, and would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The survival rate for bomber crews improved substantially with Mustang Escort, but combat remained terrifying and dangerous even with fighter protection. The ethical dimensions of strategic bombing remain controversial decades after World War II ended. The targeting of industrial facilities inevitably resulted in civilian casualties, despite efforts to bomb with precision. German civilians died in their homes and workplaces when Allied bombs missed their intended targets or when fires spread beyond industrial areas. The moral complexity of these operations troubles historians and philosophers to this day. The Mustang pilots who flew escort missions bore no direct responsibility for bombing target selection or civilian casualties. Their mission was protecting bomber crews and destroying German fighters, but they were participants in a strategic campaign that resulted in substantial civilian suffering alongside its military objectives. Many Mustang pilots wrestled with these ethical complexities during and after the war, recognizing that their individual actions contributed to broader consequences they could not fully control or comprehend while focused on immediate tactical situations. The post-war careers of Mustang pilots reflected the extraordinary training and experience they had gained during combat operations. Many continued in military service, flying jets in the newly independent United States Air Force and combat missions during the Korean War. Others returned to civilian life, becoming airline pilots, test pilots, aviation executives, and aerospace engineers. The skills they had developed flying Mustangs over Europe translated effectively to both military and civilian aviation careers. Bud Anderson, who flew 116 combat missions in Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group, became a respected test pilot and retired as a full colonel from the Air Force. Anderson destroyed 16 and a quarter enemy aircraft in aerial combat and another on the ground. He survived the war despite flying some of the most dangerous missions over Germany and continued contributing to American aviation development for decades afterward. Chuck Yeager, who shot down his first German aircraft while flying a P-51, became the first person to exceed the speed of sound when he flew the Bell Zone research aircraft in October 1947. Yeager's combat experience in Mustangs provided the foundation for his legendary test pilot career that advanced supersonic and high-altitude flight development throughout the 1950s and 60s. Hundreds of other Mustang pilots made similar transitions from combat to peacetime service, applying the skills and discipline they had learned during the war to advancing aviation technology and capability. The P-51 created not just tactical advantages during World War II, but also trained a generation of aviators whose expertise shaped post-war military and civil aviation development. The Mustang remained in operational service long after World War II ended. The aircraft fought in the Korean War, providing close air support for ground forces and maintaining air superiority against North Korean and Chinese fighters until jet aircraft like the F-86 Sabre assumed that mission. Mustangs served in air forces around the world well into the 1950s. Some nations operated P-51s in counterinsurgency roles into the 1980s. Hundreds of Mustangs remain airworthy today, lovingly maintained by collectors and vintage aircraft organizations. Air show audiences regularly witness the distinctive sound of the Packard Merlin engine and the graceful lines of what many consider the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever built. These flying examples preserve tangible connection to the men who flew combat missions over Europe 8 decades ago and to the engineering achievement the Mustang represented. The story of the Mustang over Germany represents a decisive moment when technological innovation, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine converged to produce strategic results. The aircraft itself was exceptional, but the Mustang's impact derived equally from the industrial system that could produce thousands of examples, the training programs that prepared pilots to fly them effectively, the logistical infrastructure that kept them operational in forward bases, and the strategic vision that understood how to employ them for maximum effect. German pilots watching American fighters circle over Berlin in March 1944 understood immediately that their nation faced an opponent with overwhelming advantages in every dimension of modern warfare. The Mustangs overhead were not just fighters. They were symbols of American industrial might, technological capability, and strategic reach. They represented a level of resources and organization that Germany simply could not match while fighting on multiple fronts against enemies who collectively outmatched German capacity by orders of magnitude. The admission by Hermann Göring and other Luftwaffe leaders that the long-range escort fighter was one of the most decisive factors in Germany's defeat validates the strategic importance of the P-51 Mustang. This professional acknowledgement from experienced military officers who understood air power doctrine and strategic dynamics confirms that the Mustangs' appearance over Germany fundamentally altered the course of the air war and contributed significantly to Allied victory in Europe. For Hauptmann Walter Oesau, who witnessed those first Mustangs over Berlin and died 2 months later in combat against American fighters, the moment represented both a tactical crisis and a strategic revelation. His professional skill and personal courage could not overcome the CISO's fundamental imbalance between Germany's dwindling resources and America's expanding war machine. The Mustangs circling overhead demonstrated conclusively that Germany had challenged an opponent with unlimited industrial capacity, superior technology, and the strategic depth to sustain operations indefinitely, regardless of casualties or setbacks. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived the war carried memories of fighting against overwhelming odds in aircraft that grew progressively more obsolete, while fuel supplies dwindled, training standards collapsed, and experienced comrades died in numbers that could not be replaced. Many developed professional respect for the P-51 as a weapon system and for the American pilots who flew it effectively. This respect emerged from direct experience that could not be dismissed through propaganda or nationalist sentiment. The final accounting of the Mustangs' contribution to Allied victory in Europe can be measured through multiple metrics. 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed. Bomber loss rates reduced from operationally unsustainable to strategically acceptable levels. Complete air superiority achieved over Western Europe by June 1944, enabling successful invasion and liberation. The systematic destruction of German fighter forces through continuous combat that exhausted pilot reserves and fuel supplies. But perhaps the most important impact was psychological. The presence of American single-engine fighters over Berlin, accomplishing what German military planners had assured their pilots was impossible, shattered confidence in German technological superiority and strategic assessment. When your own experts prove wrong about fundamental capabilities of enemy weapons systems, when the impossible becomes routine, when every day brings fresh evidence of the opponent's advantages, hope dies. That death of hope, more than any tactical defeat, pushed Germany toward surrender. The men who flew Mustangs, from English bases to Berlin and back, accomplished missions that tested both human endurance and aircraft capability to their limits. They fought against determined enemies who possessed skill and courage, but lacked the resources and support to compete effectively. The combination of America's finest fighter aircraft flown by America's best-trained pilots against an enemy with obsolete equipment and desperate determination produced the outcome reflected in the statistics. American dominance complete. German resistance broken. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.